Thank you indeed. I particularly liked the title, Bridging Diasporas, and of course, you raised a number of political issues and matters pertaining to access, and of course, foregrounded the importance of digital resources. But what I found particularly exciting was the way in which both presentations, and indeed Jennifer's and Gail's presentations, gave rise to many possibilities for collaboration and interchanges. I found myself creating MA courses, interdisciplinary MA courses, as I was sitting there and kind of inventing all kinds of research proposals based on the chronological look at what was on offer, what was potentially there for us to use as Caribbean scholars and indeed as scholars who work in many different media. We have, therefore, 30 minutes in which to ask questions of our two presenters. So I would like to open the discussion to the floor. If anybody wants to ask, yes, of course. Indeed, if anybody would like to ask questions of the two earlier presentations, because we had limited time, please feel free to do so. Yes? And don't forget to use the mic. So Jennifer and Gail, you're there.
Okay, I'm Jens. Well, it works. Yeah, I'm Jens Bohl from UNESCO. Well, I thought those presentations were tremendously interesting, and I just one comment and one or two questions. The comment is on the transnational nature of these archives. I thought it came forward very clearly how complex their the belonging of those archives are, and maybe the truth is they belong to humanity. I mean, literature is universal, and when I heard, for instance, Lillian said, you said that some of those writers would wonder whether they were Cubans or Americans. Well, maybe they were just citizens of the world. I mean, where should their archives go? But still, in relation to that, I have one question though, because since we are often talking about exiled writers, there are lots of dissident writers in the world today, lots of people who live in authoritarian countries who have fled or whatever. So there will be situations where those manuscripts and their archives, if they survive, they will be somewhere distant from the place they came from in any case. And then I just wonder, are you aware, for instance, you, Heather, at Beinecke, whether there have been any claims at this point for restitution of archives, bringing them back to some other place, a country that maybe has gone through a democratization process or something like that. And then I have another question for Lillian. That's on what you said about educational activities that you had launched at Miami, the University of Miami. So I just wonder, to what extent has Cuba been involved in this? Has there also been educational research activities in Cuba, maybe in cooperation with you, using those archives? Thanks.
So, as far as I know, to answer your first question of, has there been a question of restitution or of returning of materials? Not that I know of, and not of. Is it me? I'm sorry. I'm here. Not in any of these materials. Now I'm like the Ortiz, for example, the Fernando Ortiz materials that are, they have recently been processed. I would venture to say that at some point, there's going to be some, questioning about what are those materials doing at the University of Miami, but that's not theater, so I'm glad I don't have to deal with that one. And in terms of educational activities, so a lot of the, in terms of digitization, so the materials that get digitized in Cuba have come to Miami in CDs. We upload them to the theater archive, and then the CDs go back to Cuba. The materials that are filmed as well, the DVDs go back to Cuba, and we video stream them in, through the theater archive platform. Now, the kind of real engagement, both with the physical materials as well as the digital materials that we have, not just in Miami, but in New York, in other places, doesn't quite happen in Cuba because of their internet situation. So the archive, it's very hard for them to get to the archive or to any other kind of heavy platform. So what we're working right now is creating a mirror site that will be kind of hosted at the University of the Arts, and then their students there interested in doing research on diasporic artists or Cuban American artists, or even on the materials that they have in their collections at the library of their university, that they will be able to do the research, upload information to the archive on this mirror site, and then we'll figure out how the mirror site will come back and forth. But at this point, I would say probably about 80% of the information that's on the archive has been student generated.
That's a very intriguing question about restitution, because I feel that's something that is more recognized in art history and in museums, and I think that's something that might start to impact archives as it starts to kind of gain more momentum. And I think with colonial records, it's really difficult to know who do those records belong to, the colonizers or the colonized. And one case I can think of in Canada is the Hudson Bay Company records. And the Hudson Bay Company was central to Canadian history from the 17th century onwards. And those archives were originally held at the company's headquarters in London. And they initially were closed to the public, and then they opened the archives in recognition that they were so important for studying Canadian history, and then they eventually moved to Canada. And I think that case, it's a little bit simpler in that the Hudson Bay Company itself moved its headquarters from England to Canada. And there's also this kind of one-to-one relationship. It's one company in one country. And in the case of the Caribbean especially, I think it's not always as straightforward, or perhaps it is, but my impression is that it's a bit more of a complex situation. And I think in terms of contemporary collecting, Kevin, I think, could speak to this better, but I think what's hard with private archives is that individuals and individual businesses or private businesses, they can sell or give their archives wherever they want. Legally, it's not like government records where legally it has to stay in a particular country. And so my guess is that it would be hard to just get a collection out of a country if there was some sort of claim culturally made to it. But Kevin, I think you could probably speak to this better than I can. But yeah, I can. Kevin? Oh, okay. Okay. I won't make Kevin then give his paper now, what he was planning on talking about tomorrow. But.
No, I can. Am I doing? Yeah. Hello. Yes. We have never had any attempts to have material repatriated. We do have some archives that are highly contentious. The Yuhud Amikai archive is probably the most contentious of the archives that we have. That archive, Yuhud Amikai is the national poet of Israel, And the fact that the archive, that Yehudit decided to sell the archive to Beinecke at the end of his life really was deeply upsetting to many people in Israel. And so there's a lot of unhappiness about that, but certainly no attempt to try to reverse the decision. And as far as archives that we've purchased abroad and then brought here, we always bring them with an export license, so there's no chance that those things would ever be. Those are decisions that presumably, at least in Europe, that would not be reversed. And although there is at Yale the famous situation with the Machu Picchu and the Hiram Bingham material, which the Peruvians demanded that would be returned to them. That's not at Beinecke, obviously, it's at the Peabody Museum. But after a lot of diplomatic wrangling, Yale decided to return that material to Peru, even though we had signed documents from the then Peruvian government giving us the permission to export them initially and to bring them into the United States. So that has happened. The other thing I would just add to what's been said about exiles is that most of the archives, the European archives that we have, or at least, I would say probably most of the major ones, are from European exiles, East European and Russian exiles, who came to America. The Czesław Miłosz papers from Poland. Those are archives that are really diasporic in the sense that part of them are still, the part before emigration is still in the country of origin. So there's a good collection in Krakow of Miłosz and Joseph Brodsky's papers. The Russian State Library has a very large archival component there as well. But these, one of the interesting things, we have a lot of these Russian and East European immigrant archives, and the story about them is really how these people come to America and do not abandon their cultural heritage in any sense, but at the same time become part of a real American immigrant community on their own right. They found their own journals and newspapers and have their own networks and that sort of thing, so that the idea that their papers could end up at a place like Beinecke Library was for them really a very wonderful thing.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. I just wanted to follow up on some of those points there, because Mr. Ramchand also this morning raised an open question about repatriation and were we aware of any precedents. And I said to him in private conversation that although occasionally one hears or reads emails from archivists who are slightly uncomfortable about collections which their predecessors have acquired, there are no, as far as I know, there are no celebrated cases of repatriation. There might be a few papers that get transferred to, they've obviously disappeared from another collection and they get returned to their original collection. But even where an institution buys a collection that they later feel that they probably shouldn't have bought, there's a great reluctance to return any such collection. And I don't see that happening, and I don't see it becoming a significant movement. I think realistically, whilst one understands completely some of the statements that have been made today and the strength of feeling, including the sort of strength of feeling that Kevin was just referring to amongst Israeli scholars, realistically that sort of repatriation is very unlikely to happen, especially in cases of original purchase, because people are terrified of precedent. In the world of museums, you get repatriation in the case of artifacts with religious significance. But I think generally speaking, for this network and taking a realistic look at what might happen for the public good in the future, it's much more important for us to look at ways of making institutions or encouraging institutions to cooperate with each other. And I'll just finish with a question to bring the panel back into this. The Thistlewood papers, for example, form part of a wider collection of Thistlewood family documents in Lincolnshire, and it actually extends to the leader of the Cato Street conspiracy, Arthur Thistlewood, who in 1820 planned to assassinate the entire British cabinet, but only managed to kill one soldier. And he was a fascinating person who also fought on both sides in the Anglo-French wars of the 1790s. Now, there's lots of papers like that already in Lincolnshire. What one would hope might happen would be a dialogue between the Beinecke and Lincolnshire archives in order that the Thistlewood papers collectively could find some sort of common context, maybe some exchange of copies or some form of cooperation to ensure that the wider Thistlewood archive has its integrity respected. But my view is that discussion about repatriation isn't really going to take us very far.
Yes, Alice.
I just want to say thank you to both speakers, and to kind of follow up on Jens's point that maybe these belong to the world, or maybe at least we can see there are fairly compelling reasons for seeing them belonging to more than one place. But I think there's a danger if we go along that line of reasoning, that we just, it's a kind of, without kind of also taking into account the fact that world orders are not equal, the economic factors in world orders are not equal, and that if we kind of, in a way, that may be a dangerous rationale for the loss to locals, smaller, less economically robust places. And so I just wanted to kind of put that into the conversation, that I think it's, although I understand it, I think that we have to remember what the kind of consequences of that may be in the age of late capital. But also to say that I thought that Lillian's project is just such an inspiring and amazing example of what, with commitment and resource and a genuine kind of creation of a educational and cultural community, the way in which we can kind of not manage these issues, but at least really make them visible and work creatively and positively with them. And I'm really feel really kind of happy to see that work and very inspired by it. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks, Alice.
For the question of repatriation of documents in the native country, in France, we had the example of the original documents made in Hangul, the first printed versions of Korean, and there was a kind of involvement of the French government to give these documents back to Korea some years ago. And at that time, the government was heavily suspected to have economic reasons in order to sign a very fruitful contract with the Koreans in order to make the speed train railways. And as you can imagine, there was a very strong reaction from the National Library of France. For years and years, they were reluctant and hostile to this agreement with the Korean government, and eventually through the active help of the former Ministry of Culture, Jack Long, these documents were given back to Korea, and it's not necessary to say that they were first very brutally taken from Korea in the end of the 19th century.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any questions to our speakers or the two previous speakers?
Yes, I'm referring to the Thistlewood Papers. In the 1960s, the UWI at Mona actually acquired a photocopy of the entire Thistlewood diary. So we actually have a photocopy which has been used many times in research. And actually, when we heard that the papers were coming on the market, well, we realized that we would not have been able to afford to buy them. But at least Mr. Ingram had in the past repatriated quite a lot of British documents. So we have photocopies and microfilm of quite a lot of those documents. And I think that people should think of that sort of arrangement, because we could never compete in terms of acquiring them, but copies. And now that we can digitize them, I think that that is probably the way we would have to go to repatriate our any documents that are available.
I'm finding it a little bit difficult to see.
I know.
But there's a light in front of me. Is there anyone else who would like to make a comment or ask a question? Yes?
Well, yeah, I think that most of us can agree that digitization is a way forward, a very promising way forward. But the next series of questions then concern, of course, how to digitize, what the conditions, how, and all the issues with copyright, what have you involved. So maybe as part of best practices that can come out of this project, there could also be thoughts about the way that digitization of literary manuscripts could be done in the future. I mean, relationships between our institutions and so on. There could be a series of best practices. And I should mention that well, I'll talk about the Memory of the World tomorrow, of course, but in 2012, when there was the Digital Memory of the World conference in Vancouver, then an outcome of this was the Vancouver Declaration on born digital archives, and also on digitization, and on then the work that should be carried out to create best practices and standards. And indeed, what Alison talked about, the taking into consideration the fact that we are not equal in this world, and so how to empower the people and societies who do not have that much power, but to make sure that when we talk about sharing archives, then it's true. It's not only for the most resourceful to access those documents. So I would simply then also encourage that we work within that context. I mean, that we try to impact the follow-up to the Digital Memory of the World conference by getting the specific concerns relating to literary manuscripts on board, and that maybe this network, as part of the results of its work, there are many things to be done, of course, but I think that this work on best practices for digitization is an important one.
Thank you.
Sorry, very, very quickly, Chair. There's what's happened in the past and the compromises that we may need to reach, and is actually best practice for the future. And I think that it's not good enough to say just because some people are, some countries are rich or some institutions are able to purchase and others are not, that the situation which exists at the moment is an acceptable situation. And I think in archives where, as I think Heather's already mentioned, the situation is moving, and where I think that within the next 10 to 15 years, the issue of the appropriate place for collections will become much, much more important. And also at a time when the archive profession generally, right around the world, is becoming more disciplined and is becoming more mature. We don't need now to validate our role by just having more and more and more and more collections. We now, for the most part, have got significant collections, which mean that our institutions are safe or should be safe. The need to be moral about acquisition must be something that this network aspires to. Otherwise, we're failing. There's been a lot of anarchic collection building in archives, and I think we should acknowledge it, just as there has been in museums. And I think that the past is the past, but what happened in the past is not an excuse for what happens in the future. Thank you.
I think that is a very excellent note on which to end. And I would like to thank Heather, Jennifer, Gail and Lillian for 4 very, very fine presentations, which have certainly given rise to given us much to think about in terms of collaborations and use of archives. So thank you very much, and thank you. Seriously.
The bus leaves at 8:45 tomorrow morning for those who are at the Hyatt. And 3, tonight, the bus, for those of you who are going to Alcian, the bus will pick you up at 6:30. That is what, 1,800 hours.